Okay. I wondered actually whether the events in Iran would come up, as I suppose they should. And I've thought about how I might address them, which is outside the scope of what we're really here to do today. But I would point this out, I suppose. It's an occasion for thinking about the differences between utilitarianism and deontology with respect to settling moral questions. The utilitarian would likely say that because consequences determine the moral value of an action, we can't decide whether the events in Iran are right or wrong until they have played out, until the outcome becomes clear. If the outcome is good, then they were right. If the outcome is bad, they were wrong. The deontologist, of course, and in our seminar, we were concerned with the great deontologist Kant. The deontologist would say, no, that's not the right way to think about things. That's a matter of reducing fundamental moral questions to mere matters of prudence. Rather, Kant would insist that we need to determine in advance, by means of reason, what course of action is the right course of action, and to evaluate that irrespective of possible consequences. The utilitarian approach, at least in a circumstance such as this of warfare, looks almost as though it justifies the cliche might makes right, which I think would be widely perceived as a non-moral or even immoral principle. Might makes right to the extent that if the outcome of a hostile action is positive, then the moral value of that action is judged as positive. Another way of paraphrasing that is to say that might makes right. Kant would insist the decision has to be made in advance by means of reason, and that has the disadvantage of being enormously complicated, because of the very many different interests involved, because of the different perspectives from which the question can be posed, and so forth. So I just wanted to toss that out here. The historical moment is a kind of teaching moment, as we say, in that it constitutes a strong example of how one might think through the strategic differences of utilitarianism and deontology. But I'll leave it there. Vsevolod asked me to speak to the question, delivering philosophy to the general public. And I am in a bit of a quandary as to how to address this question. Let me explain what I mean, and then I'm going to give you the choice of how you want me to proceed. First of all, and in fact, Vsevolod's mention of the Iranian film brings this to mind, but I was going to mention this anyway. One could address this question, delivering philosophy to the general public, by asking how one might pitch ideas in philosophy through popular films. I think of Richard Linklater's Waking Life, for instance. I don't know if you know that film. Linklater's two most recent films are on Netflix currently. He's a very fine filmmaker, in my opinion. But he was a philosophy student at the University of Texas at Austin, and Bob Solomon was one of his mentors. And Waking Life is an animated film, basically about existentialism, and one of the characters in it is Bob Solomon, who is interviewed at a cafe. So Waking Life is a pretty obvious example of presenting philosophy in a format that is entertaining and widely accessible, rather than in the format of essay or book or something that these days in particular seems not to be a particularly popular format. So there's films, there's TV shows. I don't know if you folks have seen The Good Place. It has received a lot of attention in America and a lot of praise as well, especially from philosophers. One of the characters in the show is a philosopher, but I think that it's a very superficial treatment of philosophical ideas, and I'm not fond of it. Still, one could address this topic, delivering philosophy to the general public, by talking about entertaining media like film and television, or literature. Philosophy in literature is a popular course in many universities in America. And in fact, a good friend of mine and a colleague is teaching a course this quarter on love and caring. And his first reading is on a Karenina rather than a philosophical text. So one could pitch philosophical ideas through genres other than the traditional philosophical genres. And maybe that's one of the things that you'd want to talk about in the context of our topic here. Or one might mention, for example, the so-called experimental philosophy movement. I don't know if you've heard about this. The premise of the movement, as I understand it, and I don't think there's much talk of it anymore, but about 10 years ago there was. The premise of the movement was that philosophers traditionally have too often relied on their own intuition for settling questions about abortion or whether this or that is morally acceptable. And the premise of this movement was, well, why suppose that any single individual's intuition should be able to settle such questions? Why not instead construct surveys and find out what hundreds of people or even thousands of people have to say on these topics? A way of sort of developing a social science database as a response to fundamental questions in philosophy. That would literally be delivering philosophy to the general public in the form of surveys that ask people on the street, the general public, to respond to philosophical puzzles. My book, my forthcoming book, and this is one of the things that Vsevolod, I think, was hoping I would talk about. My forthcoming book is, in its way, an attempt to bring philosophy to the general public, but in a different way. It provides an account of the development of ideas about God, the soul, and the limits of knowledge, from Plato through Descartes to Kant and beyond. And by tracing that history, the book gradually develops the reader's own sophistication, leading from the common sense of the general public to ever more subtler considerations, to a more philosophically sophisticated perspective. What I'm saying is that there's a continuum here. Common sense asks and has answers for all of the questions philosophers ask. But philosophers answer those questions more carefully, more subtly. And that makes philosophy difficult from the perspective of the general reader or the general public. Still, there is a continuum here. So I think it's possible to begin with fundamental questions and proceed from there to the more subtle and difficult questions that are implied in the background. In light of that, what I've done here is to have written out a lecture. Those of you who took my Kant seminar know that I'm kind of compulsive about that, and I may have done too much with respect to writing out that lecture. I think I'm worried that it may just be too much. I presented it last night to my wife, and she said, no, you can't present that. People can read that if they had the text, but it's going to bog down in details. You're going to have to trim it way down. So here is the options. 3 options as I see it. 1, I can deliver the lecture as written. It's about 6 pages long of my text. It'd take, I think, about an hour to present. But it is dense and it has a lot of detail, a fair number of quotations. Second, I'd be happy to sketch what I've covered in that lecture, but in a much more informal way, and then go to a discussion of whatever ideas you feel you'd like to explore, whether they're related to the talk or not. I've actually sketched out a number of questions that I would like to ask and get your impressions of. Finally, thirdly, we can just simply go to the discussion right off the top and just jettison any explicit attention to the address to this question of bringing philosophy to the general public, which I've sketched out on paper. So, which do you prefer? Maybe I'll give you a taste first, very briefly, of what the lecture attempts to do. Okay? Sound good? All right. Philosophy begins, of course, with the ancient Greeks, and Socrates is famously famous for the slogan, the defining principle of philosophy that, quote, "the unexamined life is not worth living," unquote. So it's my conviction, I'm not just saying this, it's what my book tries to perform. It's my conviction that philosophy starts with common sense, with the general public, with the unexamined life, but then deepens that unexamined life by exploring what common sense presupposes. So, for example, just for example, everyone's concerned about ethics, holding people responsible for their actions. The common man, the general public, is concerned about such issues. But what does ethical responsibility presuppose? What must be the case in order to be able to hold people responsible for their actions? Well, philosophers will quickly say free will. If I'm not free to choose, I can't be blamed or praised for what I do. If I have no free will, I'm essentially a machine, a meat machine, a biochemical machine, but a machine nonetheless. Well, what might be necessary for free will to be possible? Because my example of being a machine, as that illustrates, physical objects, machines, bodies, are not free. They're determined by the laws of physics and biology and chemistry and whatever else, by scientific laws, determined by laws. And that which is determined by laws is not free to disobey those laws. So if indeed I am just a material thing, a body, then I can't be free. Bodies are not free. They're determined by the laws of physics. So it would appear that the condition for the possibility of freedom is that I have some aspect of myself which is not reducible to the physical. There must be something metaphysical about me. I must have a soul or a mind or something that is not material the way the body is, because otherwise freedom is unthinkable. There you see that there's a transition from the common sense public concern for holding people responsible to the very much more difficult philosophical question of how we reconcile free will and determinism. So my point here is one question leads to the other. We start with common sense, we start with the public opinion, but if we're philosophers, we move beyond that. So bringing philosophy to the public might be a matter of showing the public how the questions that it already considers important presuppose a deeper philosophical address. My lecture is an attempt to sketch out three ways in which that's the case. But I can do that either pedantically by working through the details and reading quotations, or I can do it more or less off the top of my head in an informal fashion, and then we can go to the discussion. So preferences, what would you like me to do? The second, the informal approach. Yes? Okay, so it shall be. All right. So let me start with this Socratic slogan again, that the unexamined life is not worth living. Philosophy then begins with common sense and with the general public, but it then deepens that perspective. Former teacher of mine, Maurice Natanson, defined philosophy when I was an undergraduate as, quote, a critique of presuppositions, which is a breathtakingly brief definition of the discipline, but I think a useful one, a critique of presuppositions. What philosophy does is to call into question what ordinary consciousness takes for granted as true. I'll give you just one of so many possible examples, but this, of course, is a dramatic one. The perspective of Berkeley's idealism, to be is to be perceived, right? The common sense view is that physical objects exist. I have literally only once in my many years of teaching philosophy, only once have I encountered a student who admitted to being an idealist. That is to say, who insisted that there was nothing real other than minds and ideas in minds. That is a very unusual view. It's not unusual in philosophy departments or in mental institutions, but it's very unusual among the general public. You will not often encounter somebody who doesn't believe physical objects exist. But prove it. Prove that there are physical objects outside of your mind. It's damnably difficult. In fact, I'm pretty convinced it's impossible. Kant comes as close as anyone has, and I'm not going to go there. You already know that story. But even he considers the independent reality of things in themselves to be a kind of problematic hypothesis. The problem is, of course, if you think about it, that all your experience of these supposedly external objects, all your experience of them, all your knowledge of them is not external, but internal. You experience that within your mind. And so although common sense can immediately recognize the power of Samuel Johnson's famous refutation of Bishop Berkeley, Samuel Johnson was strolling down a street one day, came upon a boulder. He kicked the boulder with his boot, and he declared, "Thus I refute Berkeley." And yeah, common sense gets it. Obviously, the boulder is not in your mind. You stubbed your toe against it. But how did Johnson know there was a boulder in the road? Well, he saw it there. And where does seeing take place? In the mind. And when Johnson's boot struck the boulder and made a sound, where did that sound get heard? In Johnson's mind. And the pain of stubbing his toe against the boulder, where does that occur? Again, in Johnson's mind. If Johnson has an experience of something outside his mind, he has an experience of it in his mind. He never gets outside of his own mind in order to validate the independent reality of the things that he presumes are there. So, a critique of presuppositions. Philosophy begins with common sense. There are physical objects outside my mind. Obviously there are. And then deepens it. How can you prove that there are physical objects outside your mind? Is it a necessary truth? Well, as I mentioned at the outset, my forthcoming book, which is called God, the Soul, and the Limits of Knowledge, starts with Plato and develops insight through Descartes to Kant and beyond, and thereby, at least this is my hope, it performs this deepening and leads an ordinary reader's consciousness to philosophical sophistication. So to summarize the three examples which constitute the majority of this lecture, which I'm not going to go through in detail, three examples: moral responsibility implying free will and determinism, the question of free will and determinism. That's my first example. Descartes' transition from the first to the second meditation, the transition from his proof of his own existence to his analysis of his own essence, is going to be my second example. And then Kant's ethics, the categorical imperative being the central idea of Kant's ethics, will be my third example. So I'll sketch those three very briefly here. First of all, and I've already said this, holding people responsible for their actions is very much a matter of general public concern. You don't have to be a philosopher to hold people morally responsible. But, as I've also pointed out, the question of the possibility of holding people morally responsible presupposes, if one thinks more carefully about it, if one leads the examined life, it presupposes that one has settled the free will versus determinism issue, and that issue is far from commonsensical. Still, that we might turn to ethics and away from these more difficult, more traditionally fundamental questions in philosophy. I take them to be questions in metaphysics. and epistemology. In the Anglo-American analytic tradition, M&E, metaphysics and epistemology, are considered really the heart and soul of the discipline of philosophy itself. They're the real questions, the hard questions. And I don't exactly disagree with that, even though I wasn't trained in the analytic tradition. But Susan Nyman does. There's a book by her. I don't know if I'm holding this up to the camera. There we go. I don't know if you know this book. Evil in Modern Thought, it's called. An Alternative History of Philosophy. She writes on page 5 of her introduction, she writes, get some light here, what most demands explanation is not how moral judgments are justified, but why those that are so clearly justified were disregarded in the past. That's her theme of evil. She thinks the most urgent question in philosophy is to account for the possibility, the existence of evil, given the universal recognition that evil is wrong. But she goes on to distinguish her approach from the traditional analytic philosopher's approach that makes metaphysics and epistemology central to philosophy. In her next paragraph, she writes, quote, I believe it is the place where philosophy begins. The question of evil is the place where philosophy begins and threatens to stop. For it involves questions more natural, urgent, and pervasive than the skeptical epistemological quandaries conventionally said to drive modern philosophy. It's possible to begin to worry about the difference between appearance and reality, metaphysics and epistemology, because you notice that a stick looks refracted in a pool of water, or because a dream is so vivid that you want to grasp one of its objects for a moment or two of sleepy half-consciousness. But you wake up in your bed, slap your face if you have to, pull the stick out of the water if you're really in doubt. Were the problem of evil so easy to dispel, the massive effort spent in hundreds of years of philosophy would be in need of explanation. I take it her point is clear. The problem of evil concerns all of us, whereas these abstract problems that you find in, for instance, Descartes or Kant, how do I know I'm not dreaming? How do I know that I can trust my senses because a stick looks bent in water even though I know it's not really bent? Are these profound questions that I need answers to before I can proceed any further? Susan Nyman's view is, oh, give me a break. Wake up, slap yourself in the face, throw some water in your face, and now settle the question of evil. That's something we all recognize as urgent and important. Fair enough. But as I've already said, ethics inevitably demands answers to these deeper metaphysical questions. If we are to lead the examined life, we have to ask what the conditions of possibility for moral responsibility are themselves. And as I've already said, freedom is a condition for moral responsibility. But freedom doesn't seem compatible with the determinism of physical science. And so there is a host, as I'm sure you know, a host of attempts to solve the problem of the incompatibility of freedom and determinism in the recent philosophical literature. In the longer lecture, I detailed 3 of these, one by Dirk Pereboom, one by Saul Smilansky, and Tom Nagel's famous example of moral luck. I'll just sketch that one very briefly in case you're not familiar with it, but I suspect you are. He points out that common sense would have us believe that luck has nothing to do with moral worth. But in fact, that's not the case, he insists. And he points out that there is a morally significant difference between manslaughter and reckless driving. But it may well be that, in fact, the difference between an event that is judged to be manslaughter and one judged to be reckless driving is merely the chance presence of someone in the crosswalks. So in other words, if you're out driving recklessly and you're unlucky, you're going to reproach yourself and the law will come down harder on you than if you're out driving recklessly and no one happens to get in your way. You are therefore subject to luck in moral valuation, according to Nagel. And that seems to abrogate the necessity of being free. You're not free to choose whether you're lucky or not. In any case, this is a thorny problem with lots of twists and turns. And my point with respect to the general theme today, bringing philosophy to the general public, is that everybody is concerned with moral responsibility, but only philosophers think the problem through sufficiently carefully to recognize that that basic widespread concern is grounded on a deeper and more difficult problem, the problem of reconciling physical determinism with freedom, because freedom is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. Okay, that was my first example. Here's the second. Descartes' transition from the first to the second meditation. You know, of course, how Descartes proceeds. He begins by doubting everything he thinks he knows. He points out that the senses can obviously be doubted. I'm subject to various sense illusions. I could be hallucinating, or more commonsensically and more down to earth, I could be dreaming. I experience in dreams vivid experiences which are every bit as vivid as the experiences I have when I'm wide awake. So before I know that I'm not dreaming, I can't be certain that the sense experiences I now entertain are actually true. So I can doubt the senses, an obvious source of knowledge, and therefore we set that aside for the time being. Descartes, of course, being a scientist, will come back to his justification for believing in sense experience, but it'll turn out that that's going to require the assistance of God, and I'm not going to go there. What I am going to point out is that in the second meditation, having established in the first that the one thing he can't doubt is his own existence, because if he doubts that he exists, he must exist to doubt that he exists. To doubt your own existence is self-defeating. It's logically impossible. Something must be there to do the doubting. So although I can doubt what I see and feel and taste and smell, I can doubt all of the evidence of the senses, the one fundamental, irrefutable ground fact of Descartes' first philosophy is the certainty of self. I cannot doubt that I exist. I think, therefore I am. Strictly speaking, that formulation doesn't occur in the Meditations. It occurs in the Discourse on Method, but a similar and essentially equivalent formulation occurs in the Meditations. So we'll just reference the famous slogan for convenience. But in the second meditation, having established that he exists in the first, Descartes asks, so what am I? It's conventional to say that the first meditation is concerned with the problem of existence, the second with the problem of essence. He's established that he exists in meditation 1. Now he's concerned with what he exists as. What am I? In meditation 2. And his initial answers are exactly those of the general public. What has always struck me about the first couple of pages of Meditation 2 is how completely consistent with common sense, with ordinary, unphilosophical public knowledge those pages are. If you ask the man or woman on the street, what are you? They'll answer, a man or a woman. And what is a man? Well, Aristotle says a rational animal. But Descartes explicitly says, no, I'm not going there. Rational, what does that mean? Animal, what is that? No, those are different, more difficult questions. And I'm asking something really obvious and basic. When I ask the question, what is a man? An answer readily comes to mind. Something with a face and arms and legs. In other words, a body. When someone waves to me from across the street, they're waving to my body. They see my body go by. But, and he adds this, of course, a body is not the same thing as a corpse. Although all of the things that are parts of the body are also present in a corpse. So I'm not just a body, I'm a body and a soul. But so far, this is still common sense, certainly the common sense of Descartes' own century. To say that I'm a body and a soul is something everyone would have said, pretty much. Today, perhaps not. Descartes proceeds. All right, what is a body? Common sense, again, has a very clear answer here. Bodies are well defined. They are available to the senses. They occupy space in such a way that no other body can occupy space at the same time, the same space at the same time, and so forth. Bodies are clearly defined. But what is a soul? That's not so clearly defined, Descartes admits. In fact, he says, if I've ever even thought about this, I would probably say something like that a soul is like a fire or ether that permeates my more solid parts. I don't know what that is in French, but that's Cottingham's version in the English translation, or the standard English translation today. And I find that passage rather beautifully poetic. What is a soul? I'm not sure, says Descartes, but maybe I'd say it's like a fire or an ether that permeates my more solid parts. Okay, so where are we? Common sense says, what is a man? What is a person? Answer, a body and a soul. Not just a body, because a body and a corpse are different. So it's an animated body. Anima means soul in Greek, of course. So it's an ensouled body. What is a man? A body with a soul in it. Fine. Common sense then asks, what is a body? And it has a ready answer. Something that is easily definable by the senses, measurable, weighable, occupies space in a particular way, etc. But what is a soul? Not so clear. We resort to poetry, this fire or ether, or we admit that we don't really know. We say we've got to ask our philosophy professor what a soul is. That common sense is not certain about. So at this stage, Descartes says that common sense knows what bodies are, but doesn't really know what souls are. That's where Descartes' philosophical inclination deepens common sense and heads in a different direction, departs from common sense. Because the next point he makes is to say that although it appears that bodies are better known than souls, it's actually the other way around. Souls are better known than bodies. And why is that? Well, I know the body indirectly. I know the body through sense impressions, which are interpreted by my mind or soul. Descartes says mind and soul mean the same thing to him, which is itself a kind of departure from common sense. But never mind. So how do I know what a body is? Through sense impressions. And we know the senses are unreliable. And moreover, it's through the mind's interpretation of those sense impressions that give me my knowledge of the body. There's a passage about the ball of wax, which if you've read the Meditations, I'm sure you remember, where Descartes asks, well, how do I know that it's wax? And he enumerates all of the various sense features of the wax, its hardness, its smell. And then he says, but I put the wax by the fire, and look, its smell goes away, its shape changes, it's no longer hard, it doesn't make a sound if I rap it with my knuckle. All of the features of all of the senses that had described the wax prior to its melting are different now that the wax is melted. And what does he conclude from that? That it isn't because of the sense features that I know the wax. I understand that it's wax. It's a mental act that gives me the wax. Well, he applies that sort of reasoning here too. I think I know bodies better than I know souls, because souls are somewhat mysterious, metaphysical, they're fire or ether that permeates my more solid parts, etc. But in fact, it's the other way around. I know bodies indirectly through sense impressions that are then interpreted by my mind, but I know my mind, myself, my soul, directly. I am my mind. And so although I know bodies indirectly, I know minds or souls directly. And what is known directly is better known than what is known indirectly. So we've reversed common sense, inverted common sense now. The meditation began just as anyone would, what is a man, a body, and a soul, etc., etc. But now we find that common sense's assumption that bodies are clearly known and souls are rather mysterious is wrong. Souls are better known than bodies. Now, this is a neat argument, but maybe it's bullshit, to be perfectly honest about it. It represents a departure from common sense, but this departure may be a deepening of insight or simply a mistake. As Ludwig Wittgenstein is famous for having said in the Philosophical Investigations, we need to guard against the bedazzlement, the bewilderment of our intelligence by means of language. As again, I'm sure you know, one of Wittgenstein's agenda items, one of the principal defining agenda items of his philosophy, is to clarify the mistakes philosophers make as a result of being deceived by the grammar of their own language. We pose questions that are ill-posed because we're mistaken about the philosophical implications of our grammar. So I leave that as an open question, but my point with respect to bringing philosophy to the public is that what Descartes, for example, shows is that one starts with common sense, with the unexamined life, to reference Socrates, and then in the process of examining it, one moves beyond common sense to a more philosophically sophisticated position. And that brings me my third and last example, Kant and the Enlightenment project, which of course was the subject of the recent seminar. Kant's ethics attempts to remove the task of moral deliberation from its historical, traditional, and religious contexts in order to make moral choice the responsibility and burden of every independent, autonomous individual. Philosophy, then, is needed only to make clear the theoretical underpinnings of common sense. As Kant writes in the groundwork, quote, common human reason, with this compass, namely philosophy, in hand, knows very well how to distinguish in every case that comes up what is good from what is evil, unquote. And again, on the next page, he writes, quote, there is something splendid about innocence. But what is bad about it, in turn, is that it cannot protect itself very well and is easily seduced, unquote. That is to say, from Kant's point of view, the fundamental principles of right and wrong, which he calls the categorical imperative and tries to constitute through pure logical analysis, is something that absolutely everybody's common sense already grasps. The only downside of common sense morality is that because it is unaware of its own presuppositions and is unable to justify its own certainty, it's easily seduced by immoral arguments. And so the task of philosophy is not to make you moral, but rather to show you why your intuitions about what is moral are the right intuitions. In my seminar, I talked about this. The categorical imperative has often been compared to the golden rule, do unto others what you'd have done unto you. And although that's a mistake for a variety of reasons, for example, but this gets into the weeds of Kant scholarship pretty quickly, so I'll make short of this, but the golden rule seems to motivate moral action in terms of self-interest. Do unto others what you'd have done unto you. So don't torture a cat because you would not want to be tortured. So your own interests are served by being good to others. And as you know, if you've read Kant, personal interest can have nothing to do with moral value, moral worth. So Kant wants to reformulate this principle as a pure rational principle that has nothing to do with self-interest. Nonetheless, act on that maxim which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That's the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Again, act on that maxim which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That sounds an awful lot like do unto others as you'd have done unto you. Do it only if you can universalize the maxim of it. Do it only if it could be right for everyone. Now, why do I make this connection despite the qualifications? Well, the golden rule is very widespread in ethical thought. It's found in Hammurabi's code, which I think is 18th century BC. It's found in the Old Testament. It's found in the New Testament. It's found in the Quran. And so I think it's not a stretch to say that the golden rule is one of the most widespread, common sense, public views of what constitutes moral action. And Kant provides a careful analysis through logic and reason to justify that common sense conviction. There's a passage in Nietzsche's Gay Science which captures this. I want to read this passage because I'm very fond of Nietzsche and he phrases things so wittily, but it would have been unintelligible without the setup. And in fact, when I first read this passage in Nietzsche, I puzzled over what he could possibly mean by this. But I think I've just explained what he meant. Here's the passage. It's a passage, section 193 of the Gay Science. It's called Kant's Joke. Nietzsche writes, quote, Kant wanted to prove in a way that would dumbfound the common man that the common man was right. This was the secret joke of his soul. He wrote against the scholars in support of popular prejudice, but for scholars and not for the people, unquote. To parse this again in the context of our topic today, Kant's moral theory is enormously complicated, very difficult to understand, but finally what it comes down to is a philosophical justification of the most widespread fundamental moral insight that there is in human culture. Do unto others as you'd have done unto you. Act only on that maxim which you can will that it should become a universal law. And so, although Kant's philosophy is not accessible easily to the masses, it articulates what the masses already believe. Thus, philosophy and popular opinion are not opposed. Rather, philosophy is a refinement and consummation of common sense. And so I think if we are to take philosophy to the public, we need to recognize, first of all, that common sense and the public opinion are not foolish. They are the foundation, the subject matter of philosophical reflection. All right, and that summarizes what I have talked about in considerably more detail in the lecture that I didn't just read. So I'm done with respect to my presentation. I've got several questions I'm eager to ask by way of stimulating discussion, but let me just open things up to you and see if you have any questions concerning that presentation or anything related to it.
Paul, thank you very much for this presentation and particularly highlighting how we can use the elements of popular culture to prove our point, or at least make it more visible. I guess it's very important, and my question will follow this logic. And this goes to you, Paul, first, and to everybody to think about. Where do you think lies this line, this border between, actually doing a philosophy with concepts and this hard thinking and this very direct speech as we can sort it in meditations, for example, because these first parts, they are very easy to grasp. You should not have a philosophy diploma to get it. It's common sense. But at the same time, I guess more intuitively, we still can differentiate where we got the example of philosophical text and, just a particularly good reflection of somebody in a Facebook post or, given some comments for the news, philosophical pretentious, for example. So where do you think lies this line, this border, and in your book, how you addressed these issues? So do you stick with, the strategy that in how you right and how you're saying things, you're coming closer to this, common general audience, or you still stick with some aspects of it which make it philosophical in its very essence.
Yeah, let me speak to that at a little bit of length. First of all, I'm not sanguine. I'm not particularly enthusiastic for the expression of philosophical ideas in popular media, in film, in comic books, even in literature. On the one hand, yes, of course, philosophy as such is central to any intelligent consciousness, whether you've ever heard of the philosophers or not. In fact, I came to philosophy myself by reading Hermann Hesse's novels. When I was in high school and college, Hermann Hesse was, Steppenwolf and Damien and Siddhartha. These were books that everyone was reading. And Hesse had read Nietzsche and Kant and Schopenhauer. And so those philosophical ideas made their way into his literature. And I first got a taste for thinking about what I now understand to be philosophical ideas by reading them in fiction. But is fiction philosophy? No, it's not. You asked, where is the line to be drawn? Well, I'm not interested in drawing lines necessarily. Philosophy can take very many different forms. It can take the form of dialogue. It can take the form of, a meditation or a monologue, such as Descartes employs. In Lucretius, it takes the form of poetry. So, I don't want to limit the genre of philosophy to any particular literary subgenre, but philosophy is a systematic and careful examination of certain questions that the mind must pose when thinking about issues we're all concerned with in a deep and careful way. And however that very explicit address is carried forward, I would count that as philosophy. And film and literature rarely does that in a sustained way. There can be philosophical ideas that emerge out of a serious film or a work of literature, but it's not philosophy because it's not a sustained and careful address to those questions. Too much else is going on of an entertainment value or something to that effect. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I am skeptical that we can bring philosophy to the general public by somehow employing entertainment media, whether it be film or comic books or video games or anything else. We can introduce basic philosophical ideas by such means, but we're not doing philosophy when we do that. We're making amusing films or video games. And that has its place, but it's not philosophy, even if it touches on philosophical ideas.
Yeah, thank you. You
Vitaly,
totally
I'm sorry.
covered.
I
Think you
totally
totally
covered?
covered. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because what I really wanted to hear, this kind of normative judgment from yours concerning it. So, yeah, totally covering it. And I guess that's food for thought
Yeah.
for us.
I suppose perhaps this normative judgment, as you call it, is a consequence. Is that a dog, by the way? No? Oh, it's a cat. Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a cat.
Yeah. This normative judgment is perhaps just autobiographically a consequence of the fact that I've been trained as a philosopher. To some extent, what one supposes must naturally be the case is a consequence of what one has been introduced to and told is the case during one's formative years. So I don't want to be dogmatic and insist that I must be right about this. But it is my impression. The literature of the discipline of philosophy is a different kind of literature than literature generally, than fiction writing, than poetry. Certainly a different kind of literature than film and so forth. And the specific and concrete things can be said about what constitutes those differences, needless to say. argument being part of it. I used to be asked, I was trained in a literary tradition in philosophy. I was very interested, as I already admitted, in the intersection between literature and philosophy. I've taught courses on philosophy in and of literature. And I have often been asked, back in the days before ChatGPT, when it was still possible to assign papers to students, I was asked by students who had never had a philosophy class, well, what's the difference between a philosophy paper and, for instance, a history paper or an English paper? Because they'd written history papers and English papers. And I wanted to say, well, there doesn't have to be a difference. You can write a philosophy paper about Nietzsche's style as opposed to Kant's style. Technically, most philosophers would consider that appropriate for an English class, not for, or a literature class, not for a philosophy class. I don't want to be dogmatic in that respect. But what my colleagues would have said, and to some extent I subscribe to this, is that a philosophy paper is argumentative. That is to say, it doesn't just announce conclusions. It details the reasons that those conclusions should be accepted. It defends conclusions. And if you do that in verse form, you're doing philosophy. If you do that effectively in a film, I suppose perhaps, again, you're doing philosophy. But what you need to do is to justify your conclusions, to justify your presuppositions, to provide a critique of presuppositions. Vitaly,
let me jump in.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Because what you're telling is very interesting. I just wanted to add that, highlighting your point about style and how we can limit it or how we cannot limit it. And you mentioned Nietzsche, and just reminded me that the style in which Zeus spoke the Zarathustra was written is actually not an analytic philosophy treatise at all. But
Absolutely
still,
right.
it's philosophical in its very sense. But to get it right, you should know so much about, philosophers from before, from the past, because without these keys, it would be, just an interesting story for you, a little bit weird, but you
Yeah.
will not get it at all. And I guess this is one thing that still defines philosophical text and argument, is that somehow you should address what was happened before, and you can do it, given a very strict and not interested formula in analytic philosophy, just saying a couple of sentences, or writing, as you said, a verse or something
Yeah.
like that.
A good point. And Thus Spoke Zarathustra, of all of Nietzsche's works, is the least obviously philosophical in a traditional way. It doesn't appear to make arguments, and Zarathustra contradicts himself in different speeches. And so it's very difficult for the definition that I just gave of philosophy as an argumentative discourse that demonstrates the validity of its conclusions. It's very hard to find that Thus Spoke Zarathustra qualifies as a philosophical work, given those criteria. As a matter of fact, I think it's wrong-headed to even attempt to make Zarathustra qualify in that way. You know, of course, the misuse of Nietzsche by the Nazis. One of the things that Nazi commentators in Berlin tried to do with Nietzsche's irreducibly ambiguous literary style was to distill argumentative elements out of it. It's one of the reasons Heidegger promoted The Will to Power as the most comprehensive work of Nietzsche's. It's not even a work by Nietzsche. Its organizational principle is imposed on it by his sister. It's not a systematic work of philosophy, but Germans were fond of and used to systematic arguments. So to the extent that Nietzsche seemed to speak to certain ideological concerns that the Nazis shared, they wanted to make him seem like a systematic philosopher. That's a mistake. To treat Nietzsche as though he were making arguments is to fall into a trap which Nietzsche tries to teach you to avoid. So Nietzsche is a very special case in the history of philosophy. In fact, I'm not entirely sure I would even be comfortable myself calling Nietzsche a philosopher. I think Heidegger wasn't comfortable with that either, which is why Heidegger insisted that he himself was a thinker and not a philosopher. I think he's extrapolating that distinction from his reading of Nietzsche. But that's another matter. And I do want to get to Vitaly's question. Thanks for those suggestions, though. And yeah, we could talk about this all day, I suspect. Vitaly?
Would you please read that passage? I think that you are better in reading in English than I am. I sent it in our chat.
In the chat, okay. Plato's point, that passage?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. Plato's point is that to grasp the meaning of justice and the nature of the good life, we must rise above the prejudices and routines of everyday life. He is right, I think, but only in part. The claims of the cave must be given their due. If moral reflection is dialectical, if it moves back and forth between the judgments we make in concrete situations and the principles that inform those judgments, it needs opinions and convictions, however partial and untutored, as ground and grist. A philosophy untouched by the shadows on the wall can only yield a sterile utopia. That's quite beautiful. Who wrote that?
Michael Sandel.
Huh. Yeah. You know, this may sound like it's not a response to that quotation, but I mean it as one, so bear with me. One of the things that's always bothered me about the allegory of the cave is that it is supposed to suggest that the philosopher's responsibility is to remain focused on objects, on intelligible objects of mind, the realm of forms, rather than merely the fleeting and temporary and, in some important sense, illusory objects of the senses. And thus on the soul, not on the body, etc., etc., etc. All very well. That distinction is constitutive of so much of the history of philosophy. But here's what bugs me about it. Mathematics is on the right side of the divided line. Mathematics gives us intelligible truths. And guess what? 2 shadows on the wall and 2 more shadows on the wall are 4 shadows on the wall. That is to say, mathematics applies to the objects of the senses. That's why, in fact, we regard it as so important. So to make this division between the realm of the senses as somehow to be denigrated and the intelligible realm as the only realm of concern for the philosopher, that hard and fast duality is a mistake. And your beautiful passage here, I think, speaks to that. We must not forget that we are also embodied minds, and that therefore the experience in the cave is our experience too. We have to do justice to that reality as well as transcend it or guide ourselves through it by means of transcendence, if that's possible. Yeah, very lovely passage. Thank you. Vsevolod, you've got a Smurf hand up?
Yeah, sure. First I wanted to tell everybody that we still have slots for a couple of questions. So don't be, scared to ask Paul. You can connect your questions with your research topics, and your questions are welcome. And I wanted to ask Paul another question. Vitaly's mention of Plato just made that question more precise for me. So a lot of our students will write on something that is, kind of problem for Ukraine. So we'll investigate these problems of Ukrainian society. That it's our primary focus, and probably we will touch some triggering topics. Triggering, in a good sense, triggering for reflection, but also emotionally triggering, I guess. And in this allegory of the cave, we should remember about this later parts where Plato, in words of Socrates, discovers a special philosopher. So the philosopher, can go out of the cave and go to the light, and his friends, inhabitants of the cave, his common citizens, right? They will probably oppose that person, might kill that person, and in order to pursue philosophy, philosophers should go out of the cave and try to tell about the world not inside of the cave, but from outside of the cave. And this is a wonderful story, I guess, from this metaphysical point of view, or in terms of archetypes, it's very deep. But if we will try to see it in the world, we can see something like this. I will not refer to particular people from Ukraine, but we got this problem that the full-scale invasion just started, and some people, they left Ukraine for safety reasons. Some philosophers also left. But nowadays they continue their activity as philosophers and telling about things that are happening in Ukraine. And some of the people, they're kind of critical to Ukraine, but not in a good sense. That's my opinion. So this idea that person is a philosopher and the person should speak without the prejudice for the sake of philosophical wisdom kind of might be used as a political weapon, to say bad things about Ukraine. That, for example, we live here in totalitarian states, that we are Nazis or something like that. But I will not, bring it more because I should probably give you more context. I will just give you another example of Timothy Snyder, who, as far as I remember, left United States after the Trump was elected, and now he is residing in Canada. And Timothy Snyder, he is a kind of popular figure in Ukraine because he wrote about Ukraine many years before, and now we're, hearing about him a lot. But he also made this choice. He is commenting about United States, but from outside of the United States. Still, this is an example of how a philosopher or a thinker can do. And in Ukraine, it's also like an open question. Should you be here in Ukraine to tell about things that are going in Ukraine? For example, how you can correctly grasp the collective experience that philosophers should reflect about. If you're not not experiencing power outrages or absence of heat or missiles attack or stuff like that. So I guess my question is, how do you think philosopher should prepare himself or herself for this quest of absence of prejudice? Because somehow we'll all reside in this prejudice, but philosophers claim, or at least we're trying to claim, that we try to go out of this prejudice.
Yeah, that's a very deep and difficult question, and problematic because of the immediate political implications of it, obviously. Let me respond like this. I think it's a mistake to suggest that the question of standing outside of Plato's cave is the right way to cast the question of being outside of Ukraine and critiquing it from outside, or leaving the United States and critiquing it from Canada. Or I'll tell you why. I mean, to play with the metaphors, that's trading one cave for another. When you leave the United States for Canada, you have not left Plato's cave. You've just left the cave that was America and entered the cave that is Canada. That is to say, you're still within the context of social life, of the dominance of the senses in our understanding of the world. The Platonic allegory has a deeper and less politically relevant implication, I think, to the extent that we get out of the cave, we get out of the relativism of political strife altogether. we enter into the realm that only mathematics is a language for. And whether you live in Ukraine or anywhere else, 7 plus 5 still equals 12. So the universal truths that Plato insisted were accessible only outside of the cave don't have immediate and obvious bearing for the real life within the cave, with the exception that I noted before when Vitaly asked me to read that beautiful passage. The mathematical truths do apply within the cave. And so what one would hope for, I suppose, and this, I suppose, speaks more directly to your question as you formulated it, what one would hope for from philosophy is that one can stand outside of the prejudices and the immediate circumstances of strife that inevitably define some particular historical context and make judgments and recommendations that could, at least in principle, be seen by all of the combatants to be reasonable in order to bring that conflict to an end. Because when one is in the midst of the conflict, one hasn't got an objective perspective. So the philosopher can provide, perhaps, or one would hope, something like an objective perspective that could legislate between competing and even opposed political views or social views or cultural views, ethnic views. But that's a very vague statement. I don't know what sorts of objectivity philosophy can concretely provide that could resolve such disputes. But that's what we would hope. You know, in a certain sense, this is what Habermas's Enlightenment agenda is all about. We should resolve our conflicts through reasoned discord without defining in advance what conclusions that what conclusions that discourse should arrive at. We nonetheless should eschew approaches of power and appeal instead to I think it's Habermas that describes the Enlightenment principle of reason this way: die zwanglose Zwang des besseren Arguments, the uncoercive coercion of the better argument. Rather than coercing your opponent by force, you persuade your opponent by argument. And that doesn't decide in advance who's right. It just recommends a certain method as being the most reasonable and fair.
Yes, thank you for asking these questions. They are not easy and they are triggering, but I'm asking them only because I feel, and maybe, anybody in this chat can agree or disagree, that this level of talk about these questions kind of absent from philosophical community, at least in Ukraine. So we're just not talking about it at all. So I'm just trying, to pose these questions. And thank you for answers as well. And your example with Habermas just reminded me very good approach from John Rawls, how he taught us to do political philosophy, is that it might be not the best way just to present, an argument and counter-argument, and, you will be bleeding fighting with anybody. But what you can do the best is to provide an argument that another party would not have a reason to not disagree. So maybe that's the better approach than just try to, win the one battle and not win the war or something like that. And concerning what I asked you, I guess we also have the second part of this problem, because when you're staying in the cave, even if you're not, trading one cave for another, you're still very affected by the current political agenda, and somehow you still expressing a certain, political views, I guess. It's my interpretation of Plato that he was a Spartophile, so he tried to, spread this Sparta agenda inside the essence, and probably that might be the real reason why he was killed at the very end, not because he did something with abuse or something like that, but that he just literally spread Sparta's propaganda in the essence. So that's why he was, killed. And yeah, I guess another. Yeah, sure, go on.
I see your point, and whether or not that could be said of Socrates or Plato, your reference to Rawls is useful here. And in fact, it dovetails with my former teacher's definition of philosophy as a critique of presuppositions. Before one enters into a political debate, one should examine one's own presuppositions. And Rawls' method of employing the veil of ignorance so that you don't know what role you occupy in a given society, and you evaluate the rightness or wrongness or advantageousness of different legislation in terms of not knowing whether you yourself will benefit from them. That is a good strategy for avoiding the kind of almost inevitable political and social prejudices with which one comes to any given argument, whether it be Plato's fondness for Sparta or whether it be Ukrainians. I can't speak for what prejudices you may bring to the table with respect to these questions. But I see your point. I completely agree.
Yeah, I just want to pass the mic to Dmitro, but before I will just tell that this idea from Plato that it's quite hard to present this account of objectivity for centuries or for thousands of years. At least we can try to go as much closer to the precision of mathematics and numbers as we can. So I guess it's a good, guiding principle when doing research in philosophy for general public amongst, the war and this political instability and stuff like that.
Yeah. One of the topics that we've been discussing in the PATF group, the group of East Coast philosophers that led me to your organization, Eric Barnes being the member that did so. One of our members is a philosopher of mathematics, and he consistently insists that mathematics is the hardest form of knowledge because it's the most rigorous, because questions of mathematics are settled once and for all. They're definitive. And another member of the group has argued, no, for exactly that reason, mathematics is the easiest of our domains of knowledge. It's the social sciences that are the hardest, because the social sciences have to deal with the infinite complexities of human beings. And so one can't expect mathematical precision in the context of social thought or politics. And, both those things are true. One would like to aspire to the rigor and certainty that math makes possible, but in the realm of human affairs, that's an aspiration that will never be achieved. We're not mathematical entities. But Dimitro, you've had your Smurf hand up for some time, so.
Yes, thank you. I have a short and maybe a trivial question, but I should ask you because now previously I think I would write my research on protest and theory of speech acts, and because I found some interesting paper on this, and it's interesting how it could be applied to, for example, our cardboard protest last summer. In which way these theories, not only my, but I mean in general, could be applied to some recent events?
Well, let me ask, when you say speech acts, are you referring to J.L. Austin?
Yes.
Uh-huh. So you're thinking of applying Austin's ordinary language philosophy to the rhetoric of protest, of interpreting slogans on posters and so forth, or political slogans as speech acts in Austin's sense.
Yes, that's the idea.
Yeah, there's certainly potential there. Austin's not spoken about very much in the discipline these days, it seems to me. But I always thought that How to Do Things with Words was a fascinating book, and that the observation that language is often used in ways that are not reducible to its semantic and syntactic content, that it constitutes actions, that when you say "I do" in the wedding ceremony, the significance of those words cannot be parsed merely by looking at the meanings of the vocabulary and the grammar, that there's a great deal more built into that. And so similarly, the slogans, I think almost of necessity, when you're carrying a slogan on a placard in a protest, you need that slogan to be brief, because you need news cameras to be able to scan it quickly and people on the televisions that are seeing it to be able to read it quickly. So it needs to be brief, but it needs to express something complex and rich and controversial sometimes. And so you need to use language in a unique fashion, and to use it performatively in Austin's sense is perhaps one useful way of understanding what's going on in that kind of discourse. So yeah, I think that's a potentially useful project.
Thank you.
Sure. I have a few questions before anyone else's hand goes up. Let me just read you what they are, and since time is getting short, you can choose one to respond to or none, as you wish. These are the questions I would have asked. First, what do you all think the relationship between common sense and philosophy is or should be? Second, do you think studying philosophy makes it more likely that one will make moral choices? That is, does the study of philosophy make one a better person? Third, do you think serious philosophical questions can be addressed in other media, including entertainments like films, TVs, or novels? We've already talked about that one. Fourth, rather than taking philosophy to the general public, do you think that studying philosophy might take one out of the general public? What I mean by that is Vsevolod's theme for this seminar, or whatever this is, this mentorship, was bringing philosophy to the general public. But what if studying philosophy makes one's discourse inaccessible to the general public? That is to say, what if the discipline of philosophy is so distant from common sense discourse that philosophy actually makes one estranged from the public mind? I'm just tossing that out as a possibility and something to discuss. And then 5, lastly, is it important to determine philosophically whether or not AI is really a mind in order to safely regulate it? That is AI threatening only if it is a genuine mind? Is AI merely a tool, or is it more than that? I ask that question because it's a pretty urgent question these days, especially with respect to some technologies that have been introduced in the past few weeks that promise to do a college student's work for them, entirely for them. There's a classroom management tool called Canvas, which my university uses. And this form of AI will go onto the Canvas site for you. It will read the books that are assigned. It will write the papers that are assigned, and it will do the exams that are assigned. And so you, the student, purchases this software and then goes skiing. And you get an A because the software does everything for you, but you don't actually learn anything in the process. And, I'm not sure that is merely construing AI as a tool any longer. Some people who defend AI want to say, well, it's no different than using a calculator or using a spell check when you're writing in Microsoft Word. I disagree. I think it's very different from that. Using a calculator is unimpeachable. You're not cheating if you use a calculator to do the math for you. You are cheating if you use an application to write your paper for you. But I'm not entirely sure why. And so I think it has to do with the status of AI as an artificial intelligence. It's not clear to me that it deserves to be called that, not even these very advanced LLMs. I've written a paper about this, but I don't know how urgent, given your circumstances with the war, questions about AI are. I suppose in your context, it has more to do with autonomous drones and the dangers that poses. And you may or may not have heard that the American government declared today that Anthropic cannot make contracts with any government agency because Anthropic refuses to play along with the use of its software to control autonomous drones, or there was another thing, or to surveil the American public. And so those were the two conditions it placed, and that was not acceptable to the State Department. So I'm rambling now, but if any of those questions strike you as worth talking about in the few minutes we have left, but if you have a different question related to your research project, I'm all ears. Vitaly.
Yes, I want to say something that connected with that AI problem. I think the main problem with AI for example, in university is that all that studying things just don't make any sense when we just use AI. We all, I think, agree that the result of that, for example, of that research, of that writing a paper, should be some reflection of merits of this student. And what bothers us is that just paper written by the AI just don't have any connection with that concrete student, and just that connection between a person and his achievements and his works just there is no such connection in such situation. What about another question? I think that distinction between philosophy and common sense should be not should be, but is especially by the way of conveying argument, because philosophers usually use very specific language that is not, for example, appropriate for, I don't know, for example, everyday usage. For example, that vocabulary of Rawls is very specific, that these words nobody use for describing political life. And I think that there is the main problem with this distance between philosophy and common sense, that it's very difficult to deep our argument, but not to make our language too difficult for understanding by non-philosophers. And answer to the first question, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, philosophy always needs common sense as, I would say, even criteria for some, maybe not in all disciplines of philosophy, but I think in moral philosophy and political philosophy, our common sense intuitions is that things that we always should refer our theory. I think that the best theory is that one that could explain our common intuitions better. Because what is the difference? Our intuitions are not systematic. They are just some feelings, sometimes some convictions, and theory makes that all that stuff just some system. And I think that in that way, all that prejudice or convictions of the chaos was in that fragment could be used as material for philosophy.
Yeah, there are a lot of ideas there. I'll just respond to one. You seem to be suggesting that you mentioned Rawls in this context, although it strikes me that Rawls is not as egregious an example as many other philosophers you could name, of someone whose vocabulary, whose jargon is impenetrable to the common person. You don't find Rawlsian discourse in the political sphere very often, though you do occasionally. But you certainly don't find Kantian jargon in the political discourse, and the word jargon is kind of a loaded word here. In general, it's a pejorative. That is to say, jargon's bad. There's a saying: if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit. And philosophers are too often accused of doing exactly that. They snow you with jargon that you don't understand in order to conceal their own lack of understanding or some such thing. Well, I see Yulia nodding here. Yes, that does happen, but I want to defend jargon. A well-crafted jargon, such, for example, once again, as Kant's, but also Rawls's. A well-crafted jargon is shorthand. It makes it possible to construct an argument succinctly that would otherwise require enormous elaboration. So, to write jargon off as somehow a strategic mistake because it's not immediately intelligible to people that are not familiar with that philosophy is to misunderstand its value, to misunderstand its purpose.
I wanted to add that I don't think that jargon is a problem. I just think that it's obviously creates some distance between common understanding and between philosophy. But as I said, some specific terminology is very important for doing philosophy, because it's very difficult to make, some deep consideration without some specific words. For example, the example of Rawls is a good example of why we need some specific words, because I don't think that in this case that jargon is not appropriate, because he writes about some difficult things, and obviously he needs some specific words. But yes, it's create a distance between common understanding, and just we can't do anything with it. I think that is why we need something like public philosophy, or some people who try to explain Rawls' theory with some common sense words. And I think that that is the whole idea of what we are talking about today. That public thing with philosophy is the main idea of that activities to explain some specific some things said in jargon with some more accessible in more accessible space.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and you're surely right that part of what's at stake in our topic today is mediating difficult philosophy, which is impenetrable partly because of its specialized terminology, to a larger public. But let me ask Nietzsche, to speak to the contrary view. I'm going to read a passage from The Gay Science. It's section 381, and it's headed On the Question of Being Understandable. Okay? One does not only wish to be understood when one writes, one wishes just as surely not to be understood. It is not by any means necessarily an objection to a book when anyone finds it impossible to understand. Perhaps that was part of the author's intention. He did not want to be understood by just anybody. All the nobler spirits and tastes select their audience when they wish to communicate, and choosing that, one at the same time erects barriers against the others. All the more subtle laws of any style have their origin at this point. They at the same time keep away, create a distance, forbid entrance, understanding, as was said above, while they open the ears of those whose ears are related to ours. I think what this passage suggests is that only journalists want to be understood by everybody. They write in a bland, bare style, the whole purpose of which is to convey facts. But thinkers necessarily mediate their thought through their special use of language. And that makes the immediate grasp by some other mind of the intended meaning of that thinker more difficult than it would be in the case of a transparent style, such as a journalist employs. But I just wanted to throw that out there. In this context, it seems appropriate. Vsevolod, I think you were next.
I just wanted to say that, addressing the question about AI, that our meeting is literally an example of what would be, in my opinion, a privilege in the next era if, AI will success. Because the general problem with it, as I see it, is that AI will and already displacing humans from their, common activities. Because even with the potential of AI used as an agent, you can tell it, well, imitate the process of scientific discussion. Make a draft, send the draft to Professor Paul, for example, or to any other professor, and gain responses and put them together. But still, it's not a common human activities as we at least perceive it. And somehow, at least as I see it, it's bringing us closer to this Marx idea of communism, where the machines will do everything and we will do probably just plain or something like that. In this respect, the future portrayed in Matrix seems like a good fit, because if we will be displayed from all other activities, we're just batteries for the AI. But still, the problem which we will face, as I see it now, the problem of equality and inequality, and those who, will be rich enough, could afford lively human connection, and those who are not, unfortunately, will be subjected to this very lonely speaking with ChatGPT in almost every aspect of human life. Of course, I'm exaggerating here. Paul, I wanted to thank you very much for, being our first mentor with this long period of sessions, which we will have in the following months. And today is also February 28th, which means that the winter is finished. And for Ukraine, it's very crucial, not in terms of calendar, but in terms of, the temperature goes up, and we will not consume that much of electricity, which means that we will have light most of the day, if everything will be okay. And it's very important that we continue, this connection, and it's given all these activities a sense. If somebody, very far abroad cares, and yeah, unfortunately, we cannot compare the weather in California and in Ukraine here because we have the snow which going out these days. So let's hope, Paul, that this meeting can give you a glimpse of this pagan spirit of change which spring brings with it. And we are very grateful that you spared these 2 hours to speak with us, and let's hope that we'll have a chance to continue.
I hope so too. And I am also grateful. I enjoy these meetings a lot. And they're one of the most rewarding things I'm doing these days. So please keep me in mind for future opportunities. Okay, folks, be safe, be happy if you can. And I look forward to the next time that we meet virtually, and maybe perhaps one day we'll meet in person. That would be nice.
It sure will.
Thank you
So
very
Paul, you
much.
have a lovely day, and
Yep.
everybody else, good evening. Bye.
Yeah.